My voice was steady, but I couldn't conceal the excited anticipation beneath it. When I came back to the living room after taking a shower, Brian got up, held a glass of wine, and handed it to me while his eyes were fixed on mine. I turned to face Brian and smiled softly as I said, "Now it's my turn." Before we opened a bottle of wine and continued the evening, his voice was forceful and low, and before he finished speaking, I leaned in and said, "Hello, you're still here. I'm sure this will be a night to remember." I was just recounting everything that happened me start from the beginning so you can understand how it all unfolded. Life has moments that divide everything into before and after. That night was exactly one of those moments. My heart is still racing with my feelings still tangled because this story began with something as simple as a forgotten coffee packet and an order left behind, but how it continued, even finding the courage to tell it now, is overwhelming. Please don't judge me before hearing it all, because this night became the start of perhaps the most forbidden moment of my life. Who would have thought that the young delivery guy I briefly noticed earlier would have this effect on me if I had only invited him in to dry off after getting soaked because of me? And now even telling you what happened afterward sends shivers of excitement through. I am 38 years old and beautiful, alone, and have been living with just myself for years. Most of my friends are married with children by now. Meanwhile, I've been sleeping alone at night. Loneliness is a strange thing. Sometimes it feels like freedom, but other times it's this vast emptiness. For a long time I felt like I was lost in that emptiness. That day I left the gym and stopped by the market, still wearing my workout clothes. My leggings hugged my body perfectly, and my top was slightly damp with sweat. But when I looked in the mirror, I still thought I looked attractive. Feeling the eyes of others on me was always a reminder of who I was, but that day the look I caught at the market entrance, it was different. His eyes lingered on me, pausing without any shyness. It was like he wanted to know me. A faint smile crossed my lips, but it didn't last. I told myself. When I returned home and set the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, I realized I had forgotten my coffee. Don't be silly and keep shopping. Coffee wasn't just a drink to me. It was almost a ritual. I was so irritated that I didn't want to return to the market, so I sank into my couch and stared into space for a while. When something was missing, it was your responsibility to fix it. As I was deep in thought, my phone rang, and it was someone from the market. "Chloe," they said, "you forgot your coffee and a few other things. We'll send them with our delivery guy after his shift." I hesitated for a moment, but then I gave them my address, and they said, "He'll be there around 8. I hung up, feeling relieved by how easy it all seemed. As I made my way to the door, the twilight darkness pushed on the windows, and the gentle sound of rain reverberated outside. I felt a slight hesitation in my steps. I didn't know who would be on the other side of that door, but strangely I was excited. I opened the door, and there he was, the young man, completely drenched, holding a bag in his hand and looking at me. It took only a second for me to remember those lingering eyes from the market entrance. Brian. That was his name. I read it off the small label attached to the bag, but those eyes, the look in them, stopped me in my tracks. At that moment it felt like time had frozen. "You're completely soaked," I said, my voice softer than usual. "Come, I can't just leave you like this." Brian hesitated for a moment, but then gave a small nod and stepped inside. Water dripped from his wet clothes onto the carpet. His uniform clung to his body, accentuating his broad shoulders and slim waist. My eyes involuntarily wandered over him, but I quickly looked away. "Let me get you a towel," I said, not even realizing the tremor in my voice. Something felt different deep down in me. Knew this night wasn't going to be just an ordinary delivery night. For first-time listeners, join my channel and turn on notifications to hear more confessions like this. Trust me, and believe me when I say this story is going to be one of the most thrilling ones you've ever heard. Brian was drying his face with the towel when I noticed that he was carefully watching me. It wasn't the casual gaze of someone glancing around. It was as if he was truly seeing a woman for the first time, or maybe really noticing one. In that moment, I felt something rise within me, something I was trying to suppress: loneliness, curiosity, and maybe even something more. This night had already stopped being just another lonely evening, and I was keenly aware of that. "I'm so sorry for dripping water all over your house," he said, his voice laced with embarrassment. Brian's tone was deep yet gentle, and the sincerity in his eyes stirred something within me. "It's me who should apologize," I replied, trying to soften my tone. "It was my market friend who asked you to do this. And even after your shift, you came all the way out here because of me. On top of that, you're completely drenched." Brian gave a small nod and said, "No, Miss Chloe." My name rolling off his lips with a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "My house is actually right around here. So it's not far at all." His voice was warm and comforting. And for a moment I forgot my loneliness entirely. He raised his arm slightly, attempting to roll up the sleeves of his shirt, but drying himself with just a towel was clearly not enough. I couldn't help but notice the movement of his muscular arms as much as I tried to divert my attention. It was useless. Finally, he lowered his head slightly and spoke again. "I don't think this is going to work," he said with a faintly sheepish expression. "If it's all right, could I use your bathroom towel? Just isn't enough." A warmth spread through me. I realized my eyes had lingered on his handsome face for too long. Despite his young age, Brian carried a mature charm. His rain-soaked hair clung to his forehead, making his sincere expression even more striking. The energy of this young man awakened an excitement in me that I hadn't felt in a long time. "Of course," I said, just in towards the bathroom. My voice didn't waver. But how I managed to mask the turmoil inside me, I'll never know. Just turned right from here as he stepped inside. Brian pulled the door slightly behind him, but it didn't close entirely. Steam began to seep out from the gap, and when I saw his shadow moving within, something stirred inside me. Steam continued to waft through the open door. I knew I shouldn't, but somehow my steps carried me closer to the bathroom. From the small gap in the doorway, I could see the mirror reflecting the inside of the bathroom. At that moment, he pulled his shirt over his head. The wet fabric clung to his broad shoulders as he peeled it off, revealing the defined lines of his chest. My breath caught as I watched the water droplets cascade down his muscular frame. His physique was flawless, his toned body a striking combination of strength and grace. I found myself leaning against the door frame, trying to steady myself, but my heart was pounding in my chest. Brian removed his pants, and now he stood completely bare as he picked up a towel and began drying his broad shoulders and chest. His calm movements and self-assured demeanor mesmerized me. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. My eyes followed every move he made. It had been so long since I had looked at a man like this, and even the thought of it filled me with guilt, but at the same time I couldn't deny the intense excitement coursing through me. Suddenly Brian's voice shattered my thoughts. "May I take a shower, please?" he asked. His tone hesitant yet polite. The suddenness of his voice rooted me to the spot. Startled, I realized just how close I had gotten to the door. My breath caught in my throat as I quickly tried to calm myself and steady my voice. "Yes, of course," I said, managing to sound as though the words had come from inside the room itself, hoping he hadn't noticed my presence. I immediately stepped away and headed toward the living room. My legs were trembling, and the excitement and confusion inside me were impossible to ignore as I tried to regain my composure. I heard the shower water turned on, the steady stream filling the silence of the apartment. In that moment, I came face to face with my loneliness, my suppressed feelings, and my desires. Brian's presence had shaken the walls of solitude I had built around myself. What was I doing? I had invited a stranger into my home, allowed him to use my shower, and just moments ago I had secretly watched him undress through the bathroom door. I couldn't make sense of myself. My heart was pounding as if it were about to burst. With a shaky hand, I opened my wardrobe. I pulled out a loose pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt I usually wore to the gym. I didn't even consider if they would fit him properly. I just grabbed the clothes and walked toward the bathroom. I leaned toward the door and gently placed the clothes on the floor. "Brian, I left some dry clothes here for you. Feel free to use them," I said, hoping my voice didn't betray the trembling inside me. A few moments later, I heard his footsteps coming out of the bathroom. He was dressed in my clothes when he came back, with the baggy sweatpants and baggy t-shirt hanging on him. Despite his laid-back appearance, he was still very attractive. He held his wet clothes in his hand, and a few stray drops of water were still trickling from his freshly dried hair. He looked down at the clothes and said, in a slightly sheepish tone, "I don't want to bother you any longer. I'll wash these and return them to you." I gave him a cup of herbal tea and added, "Brian, I don't want you to get a cold. That's why I made you this tea. Please have some." I smiled warmly as I spoke, and as Brian took the cup from me, our hands briefly touched. I felt a spark, and his eyes lingered on me again, taking in every detail. I could feel a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement bubbling inside of me, but I did my best not to let it show. Brian bowed his head slightly, thanking me, and his eyes were still fixed on me. "You're really thoughtful, Miss Chloe," he said in a low voice. Please, just Chloe, I replied, wanting to break the formality of his address. After taking a sip from his cup, he turned to me gently and asked, Are you alone? After a moment of astonishment, I nodded and answered, Yes, in a hushed voice. You, Brian, shrugged. I've been alone for a while too, he said, his voice tinged with melancholy. My gaze lingered on his face, and even though he was young, there was a tale in his eyes. How old are you, Brian? In response to my inquisitive question, Brian grinned and looked straight into my eyes before saying, How about you, Chloe? I paused. Before responding, I lowered my head a little to see how he would respond. Brian's eyes widened, and a faint expression of admiration crossed his face. No way, I thought you were at most 30, he said. But his voice was so genuine and disarming that I felt my cheeks flush. His honest compliment stirred something deep inside me that I could no longer hold back. I turned to him and locked eyes with his. I started, my voice low and trembling. You really affect me, and to be honest, you seem to be looking at me like you're affected too. Brian froze for a moment, seemingly trying to find the right words, but was unable to find them, so I continued in silence. I don't want to keep talking like this, I said. For a lonely woman, you're far too attractive. Before I finished speaking, I leaned forward and pressed my lips to it. First he seemed surprised, but within seconds he responded with warmth of his lips, and the way his hands slowly found their way to my waist dissolved every barrier between us. At that moment, loneliness and confusion were replaced by passion, and we both knew it was inevitable. Brian pulled back slightly, his eyes filled with both admiration and astonishment. I couldn't have imagined this, he said. His breath quickened. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and this must be a dream. His words touched my heart, igniting the desire within me. Even more slowly, I stood up, fully aware of his eyes on me. His hands trembled slightly, as if he didn't want to miss a single moment. I took a step toward him, my hands lifting my shirt and pulling it over my head before letting it fall to the floor naturally. My tights, is it a dream or reality? I teased. Take another look and decide. And then I slowly leaned back onto the couch, putting my body on display while maintaining eye contact with Brian. Seeing the intensity in his gaze made me even more excited, and watching his resolve waver made me realize how powerful this moment was. Brian stood motionless for a few seconds, his breathing quickening, and he freed himself entirely by removing the loose clothing that belonged to me. The desire and determination in his eyes drew me in as he approached me, his powerful hands lightly touching my knees. His touch was both gentle and firm. You, he said, his voice low and husky, you're not just beautiful. You're absolutely mesmerizing. As his hands slowly moved over my body, the warmth from his touch spread through me entirely. Brian was now right beside me, leaning over the couch and bringing his face closer to mine. When our lips met again, this time there was no hesitation. His warmth swept away my loneliness and all the emotions I had buried deep inside. At that moment, we were close enough to feel completely whole together. I felt something immense inside me. I closed my eyes and may have let out a loud sound. Not long after, my legs trembled from the beauty and excitement of what I was feeling. Opening my eyes, I looked up at the ceiling and then at Brian. Staring into his eyes and at his damp hair, my hands gripped the sheets tightly. At that exact moment, I said, Brian, you're staying with me all night tonight. And I added, I won't let you go anywhere. Brian, out of breath, replied to me, I wouldn't leave this for a little minute. Brian, the entire day rushed through my head, and I became even more delighted at the unusualness of what I was doing. I felt beautiful and could go anywhere. I said, Thank you for bringing my coffee. My voice and entire body shaking as I spoke. Brian smiled and said nothing, watching me with awe and love. By this point, I realized that I was in a moment I could never have imagined. And just as I thought this, he let himself go completely. Everything had happened so quickly and intensely that I felt a warmth inside of me. But before the effect of that warmth wore off, Brian stood up, still gasping for air. As I made my way to the shower, I turned to Brian with a gentle smile and said, Now it's my turn. I'll be waiting for you. Brian said in a soft but meaningful tone as I stepped into the shower and felt the hot water cascade over my skin. I need to freshen up a little before we open a bottle of wine and continue the night. My voice was steady, but there was an eager excitement behind it. Brian nodded with that unusually confident smile on his lips. I leaned my head against the wall, and even though it seemed like the water had erased the evidence of Brian's touch, the warmth he left behind remained vivid and alive in my memory. I was giddy with excitement, thinking to myself, I had invited a stranger, courier, into my house and allowed him to use my shower. And now that man was waiting for me in my living room. Everything that had happened gave me a sense of vitality I hadn't felt in years. I ran my fingers through my hair and turned off the shower, grabbed a towel, and started drying off quickly because I couldn't wait to go back. I had to spend the rest of this evening with him. When I emerged from the shower, I hurried toward the living room. The scene that met my eyes made me stop. With 2 glasses and an open bottle of wine, Brian was standing by the table, waiting for me. He had turned down the lights and lighted a few candles, and his large figure seemed at ease as he sat on the sofa, wearing the same self-assured smile as he gazed at me. Brian, you're one of a kind, I said, putting my arms around myself with a small smile. His preparations, his considerate actions, and his amazing charisma enthralled me once more. Brian got up, picked up one of the glasses and held it out to me. His voice was firm but low, and as I sipped the wine, I felt as though everything inside of me started to change. Loneliness no longer felt like a word. His presence transformed the moment into something completely different. This night wasn't going to end here in a way that we both knew there was still more to come. If you've read this far, I know the story has touched you deeply. There is a lot more to share, and you won't want to miss a thing. Remember to click the follow button, enable alerts, and post a comment on this article.